We're going to be doing a double reading, and we'll be using two screens. So apologies for the occasional lack of eye contact. It's unavoidable with a share skin presentation, and we've decided to do to use that facility for a few reasons. The first, what I mentioned earlier on, is that there seems to be a microphone problem with my computer, so the voice fluctuates. So in other words, having the text in front of you helps a lot with that absence or that fluctuation of voice. And then another reason is, well, for me, I'm not speaking for Carol, I think that quite often my poetry works better on the page than via the spoken voice. So that's a sort of element of self-interest there. And also, if I tend to stumble over words, then you can correct those mistakes yourself. I don't have to do that myself. Okay, so just to introduce my reading, if you'd read my bio, you would have seen that it started with me saying that my writerly journey began at the age of 10 when I had this poem called Junkyard, a little 5-line masterpiece published in a school magazine, which I said is gathering dust somewhere in a sort of a primary school archive. So that set it in motion. It's been, a journey, a bumpy journey. And what I want to do tonight is to chart that journey in a way, to give you a sense of the stages, or to offer snippets. This is not going to be a marathon, which you might think in terms of my age. So that's just to introduce you to the format for our readings. Right, straight into the content. A couple of months ago, I think it was in February, Kobus Mulman gave a reading in which he posed a rhetorical question, and that was, isn't all poetry in a sense about death? And that resonated for me, that there was a truth in that. So I'd like to get going with my reading with two poems that deal with death in quite a literal way. The first one is called My Mother's Knowledge, which hopefully you have in front of you. This was written less than a month after my mother died, 31 years ago. My mother's knowledge. Imaged again, she stirs, my mother. She has sloughed out of me blackly, beautifully, slurring each glaring day into the next since her passing. It is early May. I walk up Cavendish Street wearing a jersey, although the sun shines. It is that time of the year that reminds me of the intimacy of time. Liquid ambers loosing their leaves. The sun shedding its last brilliance before winter, putting me in mind of other times. Time she guarded the stone of her pain so closely, forbidding its fall into our common water to ripple. And all the time, the brain behind the eyes that danced with the multiform meanings of autumn was cannibalizing itself. Wintered in front of her mirror, she told herself.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you. You're not sharing the correct screen. You need to go into the document.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm trying again. Is it there now?
Yes.
What
thank
do you see?
You got it.
See the
You
word?
got it there. Starts with my mother's knowledge.
So did you lose it there for a while? Okay.
We couldn't see the poem, but now we can see.
Okay. All right. I'll pick up sort of from where I left off, if I can remember. Okay. And all the time, the brain behind the eyes that danced with the multiform meanings of autumn was cannibalizing itself. Wintered in front of her mirror, she told herself what she had known from the first diagnosis, to clothe her remaining days in the mantle of a deliberate miracle, its blue penumbra holding us becalmed until the time. Knowing the end, she said, I had hoped it would not be so soon. She has gone, my mother. Okay, the next poem, as I said, another poem dealing with death. And this comes from a dialogue, or what I called a conversation of poems that took place between myself and a close friend called Peter Esterhazen from 1984 to 1989, which was our early to mid-20s. At that stage, I transcribed all of my poems on one of those ancient instruments called a typewriter. The conversation of poems between myself and Peter was published in 2009 in a collection that I titled Comeback, obviously paying tribute to the Dicky Birds nursery rhyme starring Peter and Paul, but on a serious level, paying tribute to Peter and his writing. He died at the age of 40 in 2004 of cystic fibrosis. And in fact, coincidentally, tomorrow will be the 17th anniversary of his death. The opening poem in the collection of poems written by Peter is titled A Wreath of 65 Roses. 65 roses being a euphemism for cystic fibrosis. Pale and thin, white, delicate veined, with bunched stalks, they droop in the sun. The diseased fruit of a mismarriage? Or was it the season, the climate, the ground? 65 roses, how quaint, she murmurs, for an illness. I draw into the shadows of a word that has hung over me throughout my life, filtering and shaping the attitude of those around me. Unarticulated, it was a misfortune. Articulated, it is a curse. 65 roses, she intones. The distance between us is sufficient for her benediction to become unintelligible, a suitable epitaph. Then the next two poems from Comeback, it properly set in motion the conversation between the two of us. I'd actually forgotten that these two poems existed until Peter's wife found them in an old folder of his writings a few days after he died. The first poem, written by me, is titled It Is. Hopefully you can see it. And the second, It Isn't, obviously. It is the mezuzah on your doorframe. It is the rear view mirror in your stationary car. It is the light reflected in your fan light. It is also the vision from the landlocked boat of the lit window behind which you stand, you who are unknown to me on the 25th floor. It is the distance between the landlocked boat and the lit window as the light goes out. It isn't the mezuzah on your doorframe. It isn't the spy hole's vacant gaze. It isn't the light web in your fan light, and it isn't your outline in a window on the 25th floor. Lipitude settled in 4 beers ago, blotting out your window, the landlocked boat, and the distance between. But when your light dies, do you stare briefly at the street-singed fog below and wonder if the same breath that clouds the rear view disturbs the mezuzah when the room shudders? Ah, it isn't the mezuzah. It isn't the eye's spy. It isn't the rear view mirror, nor is it the vision on the 25th floor that draws me to your door. Okay, I'd like to read 6 more poems from Comeback. 4 of them are mine, and the last 2, which offer a bit of relief, were written by Peter. The reason I've decided to read this first one is because, as I said earlier, I think sometimes the page does better justice to it than the spoken voice. It's called Occupation. Spend years learning how to become something, then become it. That's it then. Dentist, lawyer, optometrist, atrophy and putrefaction. Certificates on the desk and walls of the office. Reasons and motives frozen. Cut to fit the frames. That's employment. The ossifying of intentions, shaping the means to fit the ends. Then the mold sets and the means cease to matter. the ritual and the repetition, actions formulated, motives, means, and ends encapsulated, concentrated in the necessary relations, patients and clients. The instruments become the life becomes the instruments, drill bits and polishes, contracts and statutes, optics and eye charts. There's the pattern, and so it goes. Gum disease and tooth decay, libel and intellectual damages, spectacles and contact lenses. Templates for life against life. Occupation itself, that's the occupational hazard. The next one is called locomotive. Time and space out there come surging in here. The train a cyclops with myriad faces inside that look out, or one eye 100 times fragmented. Framed each by windows that rhyme with the clatter of wheels on the track. The railway timetable lives inside us. Head and heart, wheels on the track. We cannot go back. We cannot go back. Having waited in laundrettes and at bus stops, we alien few sad aesthetes who have insisted in all company on the primacy of the word. They who have lived outside of our insistence, in spite of our vision, who have never taken us at our word. We who move in spite of their wordlessness, they in spite of our words, in the same streets, through the same hours. And now, as I said, a bit of light relief. Welcome to this poem. Make yourself at home. Would you care for something refreshing, some light relief? A cup of tea, perhaps? You must be exhausted reading all these poems. And when one thinks of the unfigured multitude, can you bear the thought? Cross-breeding in bottom drawers. It is a long, bitter winter's night, and who dares be an arbiter of taste in times like these? And, oh, the poet, he's not in today. He's out selling life. Big companies pay well, not forgetting the benefits, and they love him when he is angry. Okay, the next poem, titled When in Brakpan, it refers to a couple of things that people of my generation, mine and Carol's, are likely to remember. That is roadhouses and those hideous yellow military machines that the riot police used in the 1980s. When in Brakpan, the Casbah in Brakpan serves raspberry red milkshakes in vase-sized glasses. Just flash your lights for service and don't hesitate to move closer when the car in front drives away. And don't forget the tray clasped to your window when you drive away. And it is probably not wise to stare at the khaki figures lined up, knocking back the shakes in the Caspers at Casbah in Brakpan. Okay, a year after the publication of that collection or that conversation of poems, I applied for the Gordon Fellowship in Creative Writing at UCT. And the project I envisaged for that was a collection of poems that revolved around experiences of white men in relation to being conscripted into the apartheid army in the 1980s. It was notably about men who resisted conscription in ways both within and outside of the military machine. My collaborator for that project would have been Ed Burl, who, as we all know, Ed, he's sitting here. I didn't get the fellowship, but I didn't want to let go of the idea. So I ended up taking it to Rhodes University, where I registered for a PhD. But that meant that I had to shift my voice from writing, a poetic project into an academic document, academic writing. So that sort of that shift led poetry sort of retreating into the shadows of my writerly identity through the past 10 years or so, in which I've worked a lot on journal articles and lectures, conference papers, and supervising 20 or so students their creative writing theses. I actually can't resist at this stage telling you something about me, this thing of me retreating from writing poetry into the sort of academic world. It's Carol, last week she read out one of her poems to me. I liked the poem a lot, but when she read a particular line out of one of her poems, I said, "That's dreadful, get rid of it." And she replied, "You wrote that line. You contributed that line to this poem." So, I mean, I was embarrassed. And let me just tell you what the line was. This was the line: "Primitive recognition guaranteeing masculine complicity." I mean, good God, what kind of, that most anti-poetic phrase. Obviously, somebody who's writing a thesis on the ideological construction of white masculine identity in 1980 South Africa could come up with that. So I had something to struggle against there in order to try and move back into writing more, creatively. Okay, so I did, despite this hindrance, through these past 10 years, I have been working on a sort of prose poetic memoir. And that's, I call that, the working title of that is A Teacher's Crap House Journal. And it's provided a refuge from the sobriety of writing journal articles and the like. And this memoir, A Teacher's Crap House Journal, it records a nightmarish year and 3/4 of my life, in which I was working in a school on the South Peninsula of Cape Town before I moved to Grahamstown. And the narrator protagonist of the story escapes during gaps between his lessons to the men's toilet, where he diarizes his experiences and his thoughts. On rare occasions, his journal entries help him to transcend his imprisonment. And these moments of transcendence often take the shape of transcribing and reshaping his dreams. So I've chosen to read a few of these fragments from this memoir in the making. 27th August. Literally, this is where I sit, and that is what it is, a shithole. But at least I can call it my own. Nothing else to say, but hope lives on for another day's say, perhaps tomorrow's, or the next, whenever. 29th August. In last night's dream, I sat with my feet dangling over the edge of a pier. The jagged edge of it pricked the backs of my knees and calves. Chains dangled from my ankles and wrists. I watched the water swirling around the pier's steel pillars. Then I stood and turned, and as I did so, the chains fell from my wrists and to the wooden planks. I decided not to pick them up. Their cuffs had left deep imprints. I looked to my right and noticed for the first time another pier. Attached to it by a frayed rope was a skiff that listed on the river's choppy water. I walked to the pier's end, stepped into the skiff, picked up the oar, and rowed out to the river's center. I put down the oar and dropped both hands to the river. With my left hand, I continued to pull the skiff forward while trailing the fingers of my right hand across the water's surface. 18th September. The idea of feet dangling over the edge of a pier recurs in a dream, but this time it is the feet of a woman. No details outside of these, but once woken, I decide to concoct a piece to capture the mood of the dream. Driven by the need to find her way once again, she limped to the end of the pier and, drawling a sigh, sat herself down solidly. She removed from the small duffel bag that rested beside her what appeared to be a garment, as well as a bottle of sparkling water. Then she proceeded to curdle what remained of the milk of her human kindness, before setting about her task, which was to stitch a leather elbow patch to her husband's ancient jersey. However, her devotional exercise was interrupted yet again by the crocodile's tails haphazardly slapping and chopping the river's surface. If only there were a rhythm to it, she thought. An intense dryness parched her tongue, scratched the corners of her lips, and tormented the roof of her mouth. She raised the bottle of water to her lips and drained it in 5 gulps. Flaked, she shut her eyes, and a self-knowing came to her, fiercely and ecstatically, but it lasted no longer than the lifespan of a firefly or the lifespan of a moth. She held the emptied bottle between her thumb and forefinger, threw it into the water. The frenzy of tales subsided as the crocodiles, one after another, calmly reclaimed their invisibility. Calmly, she thought, because visibility never threatens them. And this thought brought her back to the day her husband and son departed through the back door of the cottage. She had no idea when or if they might return. She directed her eyes to the opposite shore of the river, where the herons, irksomely familiar, strutted comically and pecked at stalks of grass. All for nothing, mumbled, as she resumed stitching the leather patch to the elbow of the ancient jersey. A while later, stitching done, she returned her eyes to the river's surface and felt compelled to name the crocodiles she could no longer see. John, Henry, Davy and Percival, Michael, Sean, Boris and Ludwig. She lifted her eyes, her fingers, from the ancient jersey, dropped the needle to her lap, and cast her eyes across the patch of sky fixed in the face of the river. Since moving from Grahamstown, now officially renamed Makanda, to Kleinamonder with Carol, I've made a couple of attempts at poems, one of which began in a dream and was composed in a state of semi-wakefulness. It happened to feature my friend Peter as its protagonist. It's called Glimmer. As he rowed, he wondered if his light would glow when he reached the shore. If I and his others would see it, and if its knowing would last. As he wheeled, he wondered if his light would shine when he reached the shore. By shore, did he mean the oceans he visited year upon year, or the pier's end, where always the self-same boat waited to ferry him to the other side? And by light, did he mean his hot light, or the headlight of his bicycle that glimmered as he rode? Okay, now this is the last one coming up. We live in a riverine forest on one of the just right next to one of the Kleinamonder rivers, and very close to the ocean. So I thought it's about time that I started writing nature poetry, trying my hand at nature poetry, inspired by the romantic Lake District poets, or Ted Hughes, Seamus Heaney, Mary Oliver, as well as many fine South African poets. So I made some attempts and I was not happy with any of them. And I thought, I've got no innate talent in this regard. So I wrote a poem that reflects on this absence of talent, which I called A Comedy of Naming. Mid-morning on the upper deck, he rises from his wicker chair, casts half an eye over and across the river. A pied kingfisher hovers, dives, splices into the water's face, a comma of white light. This bird's name he knows, perhaps another 6 or so. Goliath heron, fish eagle, hornbill, dringo, seagull, oyster catcher. Mourning the paucity of his lexicon, he recalls of a sudden the Naiznaluri, lately granted a new name that deserts his memory as often as does the password to his Facebook page. Without fail, she flies by each day, is each day's singular blessing, parading brazenly her copper green head and her hallelujah crimson underwing. He could swear she teases his eye as she tucks her new name under her wing. She perches nameless nearby on a branch as gnarled as his longing to name her, while her doppelganger in his notebook stands before an ellipsis that yearns to be a colon or a dash, a promise of presence in lieu of the yawning blankness of the page. The yawning blankness of the page. He sits back down in his wicker chair and gulps on his inadequacy. With what words then is he to speak, by which clauses and subclauses and couplings of noun and verb might he articulate river, sky, and bird. He shuts his eyes, reopens them, reactivates the dead eye of the devotee and chants, bird, sky, river, river, sky, Turako. Okay, you'll have noticed as a conclusion, there's a particular thread that runs through these poems, and that's the river of these poems and these prose poems. So I'd like to end with the last three lines from a poem by Ted Hughes, born from a collection of his called River, unsurprisingly. The experience of salmon fishing feeds strongly as a kind of quasi-religious experience in this collection of poems. These three lines are etched in his gravestone. So I suppose, in a way, that brings me back to where I started with concern with endings. That morning, so we found the end of our journey. So we stood, alive in the river of light, among the creatures of light, creatures of light. All right, thank you all for listening. Luckily, Carol is here to offer some antidotes to my general melancholy poetry and my cynicism and such like. So just please give us a minute or two as we swap places so that Carol can present her reading. Thank you. Thanks again.
Thank you, Paul. I'm also going to share my screen, and hopefully this time I get it right. You should be looking at a bowl of natis, I hope. Yeah, okay. So in the reading, I will be offering a combination of text and images as I enjoy the play between the two. In selecting these poems, I realized that a lot of what I write is rather personal, even when I write about nature. It is my own worldview and my connection to the world that I see around me. My connection that is a way of grasping at understanding my minuscule place in the cosmos. So these poems are snapshots. They serve as mnemonics to recall or perhaps even to immortalize certain experiences. I have a terrible memory, as Paul can attest. And so perhaps my poor memory has something to do with a misspent youth. And this first poem goes back to my young student days in the early 1990s. Just bear with me while I try and get the slide to work. Okay, there we go. Time when I was too lost to go home. There was a place where I was, sorry, I've just lost something. Please bear with me. This has all disappeared off the screen, off my screen that I'm reading from. I'll carry on. There was a time when I was too lost to go home. There was a place where I was too scared to be alone. I was not the only one. I wised up on Rocky Street, learned about dacha and reggae all in one day. Saw a friend faint when his flat was raided. But we read Descartes and Jean-Paul Sartre afterwards over cheesecake. These days, I struggle to remember the struggle we thought we fought back then. In my head, a luta continua is a phrase that remains unsung, unsaid. Wait, I do remember stumbling over boxes in Wheelbarrow Records, eating falafels on the pavement outside Bapita, being comforted by two women at the Tortue the night I ran away. These days, I prefer to listen to jazz, so I no longer have flashbacks. And then one has memories of love and love lost. And the next one is testament to that. Incidentally, the first line of this poem was used as a starting point for a quartet movement composed by Matthijs van Dijk. I won't play it now as it begins with a rather jarring and violent pizzicato, but you can find this piece on YouTube if you're interested. My poem which inspired the music is called Forgive and Forget. Truce? He asked when he came back that night, offering bright tulips against the fading light. Arms outstretched, he took in my smile. Forgiven, forgotten, we hugged for a while. Of course, memories can be good, but they can also be painful. At the turn of the millennium, when I was going through a divorce, I left the mountains. This next one is called Hogsback 2000. Mesmerized by the sparks, I watched the bonfire flame burn bright. Some sketches, a few old addresses, some photos, some thoughts, some notes. The ants in their millions had made nests and laid eggs in my boxes. Now my memories are burning, and I am learning to just let them all go. Then about a decade after leaving Hogsback, I met Paul. And this next poem was inspired by one of our early encounters. It's called Fireflies. Skin sweat-soaked, you stood in the doorway for coolth of breeze. While distant lightning flashed, a firefly spiraled a dance above your head. Though it flickered gently on and off, that uncanny light enticed us out onto the dewy grass, where our moonlit bodies became one with the earth. Predictably, Paul and I got married a few years later, and the next poem is about a very special wedding gift. It's called Typewriters. The 1951 typewriter is a wedding gift. Portable, it sits inside a khaki green carry case, edges scuffed, fabric worn, ready for travel. A Remington, gunmetal grey, with olive green keys, it has a message still on the roll, typed with faded M's and A's. May your story together be a wonderful adventure. Further down on the same paper, my husband has added these words. 1985, the first and only typewriter of my life. Her name was Erica. I remember her well. During a weekend away to New Bethesda, one of the locals told us we had to go and see the flamingos that had arrived, and we were given directions. Turn left, and then you go along the dirt road, turn right at the gate, cross over a bridge, drive on a few more Ks, go over a small drift, and drive on. You cross over another little drift, then pass a farm gate on your left. Don't go off the road yet, and drive on. You pass another gate and drive on, until you come upon the first blue agave. Pull off the road and look back with a Compassberg on your right. You will see water in the distance. That is the dam you are seeking. We scrambled through a locked gate and followed the uneven track beneath an unrelenting Karoo sun. You with our backpack and I my walking stick. We eased down through a donga and briefly lost sight of the dam. Nearing midday with little shade anywhere, we were thirsty, hungry, and desperate for a swim. As we rounded a bend, the dam appeared in sight with a flourish of flamingos flanking its banks. 3 Egyptian geese sounded a call alerting all the birds to our presence as we stole over the cracked mud pan. toward hints of shade beneath a thorny acacia. Salmon pink, even from a distance, and blood-stained billed, they stretched their necks still further, flapped their wings noisily before taking flight, long legs trailing behind, majestically lilting en masse. We camped in the sand beneath the doornboom, settling silently together to watch pink flamingos careen through the sky in an ephemeral flight my camera could not capture. Back to back we sat, our eyes stretched heavenwards, following their soaring before the unexpected descent and discordant honking as they returned skidding over the water. We watched the flock settle briefly to preen in the dam, then march onto the sand, now this way, now that, wing wagging in unison, flashing black petticoats, enticing their mates, whose moves mirror their own in synchronized dance across the sand. So, what poetry can do is attempt to describe what is seen. I mentioned at the start that I write poetry as a kind of mnemonic, and I keep these poems as my very own personal photo album. Poetry is an ekphrastic art form in that it can be a verbal description of something. Traditionally, ekphrasis is a written description of a work of art. This can be turned around where the words inspire a work of art, and interestingly, there was an exhibition in Port Elizabeth, or Geberghe, a few years ago, a decade actually, Brian Walter will recall, where artists chose poems as a starting point to their artworks. Two artists chose this next short poem, which I will read, and then also show you the two different ekphrastic interpretations. Heat waves. She dances on tiptoe, light-headed, over burnt orange heat waves. He swims naked through a cool pool of electric blue. Their movements mingle in a child painting, abandoned in the rain. So here the two painterly interpretations of the same poem are interesting. The painting on the left by Sue Hopp is titled Relationship Status, It's Complicated, and the one on the right by Andre Pillay is called Enigma. At the Transfigurations exhibition in 2010, as you'll see in the photographs, the poem hangs alongside the painting in a frame. We all have different ways of seeing things, and our interpretations of art and poetry are as varied as we are. As an example, the publicity photo of Paul Mason that appears on the Red Wheelbarrow's advertorial for this evening leads you, the viewer, to assume that Paul is drinking a cup of tea, as there is a teapot in the foreground. What the viewer does not know is that this photo was taken during deep lockdown at a restaurant when alcohol was still forbidden. What is in the teapot is not tea at all, but ice cold beer. From tea and beer and back to water again. It seems that water appears often in my poetry in some form or another. I lived in Makanda, which was formerly Grahamstown, for over a decade. And for the last few years, the city has suffered eternal water problems, much of it due to the ongoing drought in the Eastern Cape. Fortunately, in Makanda, there is a little spring that used to be a well-guarded secret, but it's now used by everyone when water is needed. Sweet water. Greetings in the name of Jah, say the dreadlocked guys readying some ganja as we reach the spring together. It is a warm Sunday morning at the sacred place of water gathering, where a bucket overflows beneath a rusted old pipe. I place a container on the stone slab to catch the trickle of sweet nectar and continue thus to fill several 5-liter water bottles. I am watched over in a cloud of smoke and stoned smiles. As I sit on a tuft of river grass, surrounded by patches of helichrysum nearby that add a floral scent to the earthy mix. Perhaps it is the herb or the warm sun on my shoulders that relaxes me and lets my mind wander. But I find myself musing, here in this city of saints, we all draw our water from the same spring. Over the years, I have written many poems in or about hospitals and health, and this next one is one of those. Shackled in Settlers Hospital, 38 degrees in the shade with no water. We wait in a hospital queue before the specialist doctor can see you. A youth, not more than 16, ankle shackled, clunks down the corridor, his eyes averting curious gazes, while the uniformed officer accompanying him flashes shiny handcuffs from a coat, bulging revolvers strapped twice around his thigh. Now and then, a patient walks by, trying not to spill urine on the floor. As fingers twitch around a metal dish covered with paper towel. The stench of sweaty bodies hangs in the stale air, and the t-shirt of a huge woman proclaims, "I am your dreams." In the toilets, a picture poster shows visitors how to wash their hands, but there is shit smeared on the door and fresh blood in the basin. With still no water, even in the hospital, we settle thirstily into reading on cold metal chairs. We wait and wait and wait for your name to be translated, and still we have no water, and lunchtime approaches. Nearby, two women debate the shackled youth's age, while I read Bosman's Cold Stone Jug. And another criminal with shackled feet shuffles by, older than the other, missing one shoe, known by some in the long corridor. The uniformed man walks by once more with his shackled boy in tow and greets you. He does not greet me, a nod to masculine complicity. That young boy's face haunts me still, and I cannot remember whether he carried his own blue hospital file or whether the khaki uniformed gun-toter did. We looked at that boy. That I remember. His eyes lowered, emotionless. Still, the heavy chain scrapes the hospital floor. While I have lived in the Eastern Cape since the early 90s, the place I like to call home is Groot Mariko, up in the northwest towards Botswana, and I still have family there. The next two poems are snapshots of that terrain. Lamp lighting. There is a hidden turnoff to Kudusfontein, where the bush glimmers from dry dust across a horizon of kameel doornbome. This is the way home, I think to myself, turning sharply to miss an unexpected boulder before hitting a pothole with a sudden jolt. Further along, I stop at the edge of the cliff, climb out of the car and look down on the horseshoe bend of the Mariko River. It always does that just here, I muse, remembering to hoot 3 times to announce my arrival before lamp lighting time. This next one, ashes. The family graveyard in Skoensdrift is filling up, the earth still loose after Lance's early departure. Avec wine, women, and song reads Uncle Alf's epitaph, testament to how he lived. Aunt Hazel, who rode a Harley on her 80th, lies a tight fit between Granny's feet and the Doorndraad fence. Rose bushes from Italy flower over mounds that hone bones of young cousins. When I go, do not bury me here. You know I am claustrophobic, but rather scatter my ashes near the eye of the Marico River, so I may return to the source. Then towards the end of 2019, Paul and I moved to a little coastal village outside Port Alfred, where we live like hermits in a tiny log cabin set in riverine forest. And it's here that we are mere mortal visitors in an animal kingdom. The next poem is Sacred Hour. It is still dark in the morning when the bats noisily return to roost in their tiny ceiling cavity. Outside, a few strays fit back for their late shift of insect control. As the dawn approaches, a fiery-necked nightjar still calls. A Eisner Turako rattles its mate awake, and the forest weaver's high-pitched warbling welcomes the break of day. Grounding. Upon this treetop deck, sheltered from the rain, my eyes stretch across the river. Meters above the ground, I feel grounded. Bosboorboom. Bosboorboom. Go back one.
Okay.
Go back. Sorry. No, one more.
Okay.
Here it is. Next one.
Back.
Forward.
Oh.
Sorry, let me just find this. We've lost the... Sorry, it was that pronunciation that lost us. Okay. Bosboorboom. I see Wendy laughing through the corner of my eye. After gentle rain, high in the bush bean tree, monkeys crack seed pods. As above, so below. The lighthouse beam tunes in to the crispness of a star-studded sky, while a buff-spotted flufftail sounds its foghorn cry, and glowworms are the forest's eyes. Morning alarm. Two fat geckos chatter and chirp inside the chimney near the head of our bed. It is 5 a.m. The sun is not yet up, but now we are. Every morning around sunrise since we moved out here, I would go for a walk on the beach with my dog, now 2 dogs, and I started recording these walks in verse. The record was short-lived, however, as the country went into deep lockdown on the 27th of March last year, and venturing outside one's own home was prohibited. The next 2 poems were written just before lockdown in 2020. Jellyfishing. Ahead, in the distance, a solitary figure walks with a stick, stopping often at the rocks. When our paths cross, we greet, but he wants to chat more. Where are you from? Where do you live? Makanda has gone to the dogs. And that bugger Tom always gets here early. He got a whole bucket of oysters. The man with a stick holds a few oysters in his hand, presumably some of Tom's share. I excuse myself to continue my walk alone. At the spot where the man had stood with his stick is a fat jellyfish, stabbed several times right through to the sand. Pajama shark. Fish gut hanging from her jaw, she lay lifeless shore. Belly up, her skin grey, pink in patches. Eyes viewed from above are no more than dark hollows. She is perfectly patterned with dark stripes from head to tail. Gently with my toes I turn her over. Her skin is smooth and cool underfoot. Caressingly I sigh. Sorry, my friend. And then the country went into deep lockdown. Suddenly I find myself seeing how many times I could walk around the house in order to clock up 1 kilometer. Then I took to furiously sewing face masks for a local clinic and learning how to keep my new sourdough starter alive, which reminds me of a poem Brian read just recently. This next one is called Scenting. As a young child on a farm in a drought, you discover the smell of rain very slowly. Its earthy aroma as it touches parched land you learn is referred to as petrichor. As a schoolgirl in a suburb on the Highveld, your nose anticipates cinnamon pancakes when a thunderstorm brews while your mother mixes batter. As a young mother, you pace the evening shift of feeding, while aromas of breast milk and baby powder mingle with freshly washed nappies to awaken your sleep-starved brain. At the age of 60, in the year 2020, living under lockdown, your hemp face mask still smells new. Air filled with bread baking wafts out the kitchen window to the garden where aromatic herbs brush against your legs. They say one's sense of smell goes when you get the virus. Yet you still smell of sea salt, rich earth, and dog hugs. And you are grateful for your nose, centered and still scenting. And the last poem I would like to read tonight relates once again to that truly precious commodity, water. In the drought-stricken part of the Eastern Cape where we live, rain continues to be scarce. This is titled Drought. That was the rain. It stopped just as it came. And finally, we would both just like to say thank you all so much for being here. Some of you have traveled great distances from your couches and your kitchens to your laptops and computer screens. But in different time zones, Brussels, London, Massachusetts, Cape Town, and elsewhere. Thank you so much for joining us. And a special acknowledgement must go to the Red Wheelbarrow for inviting us to appear on this warm and welcoming platform. Thank you, Jacques and Ed and Melissa and Amy and others who have been instrumental in getting this off the ground. Thank you, dankie, Nkosi kakhulu. Cheers.
Cheers, all the best. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol and Paul, for your wonderful reading and for sharing all the wonderful images and words with us. It was really a lovely experience. I think for the sake of time, we can open up for questions if there are any from the audience. We can maybe do one or two before we take a little break, and then afterwards we'll have an open mic session for those who'd like to share a poem or two with us as well. So if anyone has anything you'd like to ask Carol or Paul about their writing, about their poetry, about what inspires them, please unmute yourselves, raise your hand, whatever.
Yeah, raise a hand.
Here we go. Yes, Margaret, hi.
Hello.
Margaret.
Yes. I want to say hello, Paul. How lovely to see you again. And, you know, to think that you're living where we heard so much about it, with Nancy telling us all about the Kleinemünde.
Nice coincidence, eh? From our writing groups of the past.
Yes, yes. Well, and that's funny. I mean, I could scarcely recognize you, but when your voice, that I can remember so well. And
good.
And I mean, now without the glasses, now there's Paul without the glasses.
A bit grayer, hey, a bit grayer than the last time. Yeah, about 15 years ago.
Well, I mean,
Good
you're
to see
grayer
you,
than
Margaret.
me. And I mean, I never thought I'd live as long as this, actually, just think of it. But there we are, here I still am. And I'm still writing, and it's all your fault, you know that.
Thank you.
But I'm still, I'm still producing more poetry and reading it to off the wall and boring them with it. And that is entirely up to entirely your fault.
Thank you. Thanks, Margaret.
Thanks. Yes. Mm.
Go for it, Jacques. You're still muted. Here we go.
Okay, so let's see if I have a question for Paul. Let's see if I can put it into words, but it has to do with with occupation being the danger. I was wondering if you wanted to say something about poetry as a different kind of occupation that's maybe less dangerous to what we call the soul. Do you think that sharing your sort of time between academia and poetry might be some kind of defense against occupational hazards?
Oh, I mean, Jacques, it's quite a complicated thing. I mean, I wrote that, I was 22 years old when I wrote that poem.
Wow.
So there was a certain energy there, you know, but I think in some ways I've remained true to that because I've never had a profession as such. So I never called myself anything. I teach, I write, you know, I write poetry. I don't call myself a poet. I teach, I don't call myself a teacher. So I suppose there's a kind of consistency in that. But I don't want to be like rigid about it and say that a person who is a doctor or a dentist or a lawyer or an optometrist can't also be a poet or a writer. So my sense of these things is more complex than it was when I was 22 years old. And yet some of what's in that poem still resonates for me. And it moves around that I use life in that one line, templates for life against life. And the first life is the little one, and then there's the big one. Because I think sometimes occupations get in the way of life with a capital L. And that is, you know, one's soul, living one's soul, what's true to one's soul. And so often what we do, how we make a living, gets in the way of living with a capital L. I hope that gives you some response. Yeah.
Wonderful poem.
Thanks. Sorry, Jacques, quickly, I rewrote that. I mean, whenever I go back to stuff that's been published, I always do some rewriting. So that line that I just read to you, the templates one, is a new one. I inserted that a couple of weeks ago. So that's part of like poetry always being a process rather than, you know, a product. Okay, I think somebody else might want to ask a question or ask Carol a question. I don't want to dominate.
Yeah, anyone else who'd like to offer a comment or question? Welcome to unmute yourself.
Am I still unmuted?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for Carol that might spark another question. It's got something to do with poetry helping us to remember, but also maybe helping us to forget. You know, the poetry is the spring from which we drink to remember or to forget or both. I don't know. I was really struck by that image in your work. I don't know if you want to say something about it.
Yes, Jacques, I think it's a bit of both, actually. It's a nice way of putting it, is that it because poetry has so many interpretations and is so varied, it can serve at times as a memory in, you know, a mnemonic, or to remember something. And yet at other times one can use that poetry specifically to forget something, or to write it out, or almost in a kind of, in a healing way, as a forgetting, but forgetting in remembering. I don't know, I'm kind of talking in funny circles now, but I think the two are very much connected. Yeah, I don't know what other people think. Be interesting to know. It's like holding it on the page, or in words, but not, and those words themselves can change or can have multifarious meanings. So it's not static, and it can also change by interpretation of different people. Or you might read the same poem you wrote 5 years ago and it has different meaning. Yeah.
Any other thoughts from anyone in the audience?
Have you really stopped listening to reggae?
Oh, never.
Okay, okay. No, I was just checking because it's a great thing in the poem, and then I thought, well, what if is that is it healing to forget who you were back then, or is it healing to remember? I was haunted by that. Yeah.
No, there's certain things one chooses to remember, and other things one prefers to forget. But reggae is certainly one of those good memories. So hearing and listening to reggae now is a great thing.
Can I say that when I put something down, when I've written something and I've put something down in a poem, it's something I can forget about. I can leave it. It's now no longer bothering, no longer troubling me, no longer bothering me. And sometimes it's just because it's funny, it doesn't have to be a serious thing. But I never remember any poems that I've written. I remember other people's poems, but I don't remember my own. I couldn't recite them, not one of them, strangely enough.
That's interesting, Margaret. And yes, I can't remember. I mean, I have to read something that I've written. I can't recite it. No. Even if I wrote it 2 minutes ago. Anything else?
No, then I think, thank you so much, both of you, again, for taking us on this journey with you and sharing these pieces of yourselves. It's a privilege to get to witness that, and to share this space with you. And thank you everyone who's joined us and listened and shared in the poetry tonight. If you'd like to stay for the open mic, we'll take probably about a 5 to 10 minute break now, and then we'll come back and we'll have an open mic section where you're welcome to share poems. We'll go around the room with one poem at a time. If you are interested in sharing a poem, you're welcome to drop your name in the chat or raise your hand on the Zoom after the break. So thank you, Paul and Carol.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody.